You made the comment of going from behavior to structure. Other people have asked the question whether what's the nature of the science in system dynamics. I think it may be useful to look at some of the ideas that John Kemeny, former president of Dartmouth College, in his book A Philosopher Looks at Science, especially chapter 5 I'm talking about. Some of the things he said about this that I believe are perhaps applicable to system dynamics, at least provocative for us to think about. He said the most characteristic feature of science is its method. Science must start with facts and end with facts, no matter what theoretical structures it builds in between. The most characteristic feature of the method is its cyclic nature. It starts with facts, ends in facts, and the facts ending one cycle are the beginning of the next cycle. The first step carries us from the original observations to the theories. This is known as induction. Induction is the process by which the scientist forms a theory to explain the observed facts. But how do we form the many different hypotheses from which we must choose? To this, there is no simple answer, since it is essentially a creative process. He is, I think, putting a finger exactly on this matter of one constructing a model. Where does it come from? And it is not a mechanical procedure. There are no 6 rules that will get you there. There are no 10 rules that will guarantee you get a Nobel Prize in physics. It is that same kind of situation that you start with facts, namely your observations, the information you have about the real world. You develop a hypothesis, and generally down through history, those hypotheses have simply been descriptions, word descriptions of what's going on. Then you draw deductions from that theory, and here is where the traditional descriptions in words becomes very treacherous, because the word description is not particularly explicit, and the deductions are only intuitive guesses as to what that very complicated system will do. System dynamics turns the hypothesis from a verbal description, which we probably start with. We start with a verbal description, but we filter it, examine it, and make it very explicit in a quantified system dynamics model, from which then we can make deductions, and the deductions are absolutely certain. The deductions from that model are the computer simulation results generated in a computer. There need be no doubt whatever that the simulation results are a consequence of the model that has been defined, even though those consequences may be quite surprising to even the people who made the model. Then you look at those consequences and you test them at that point against the behavior of the real world. And initially you may find it's quite absurd. And now you will have to go back, as Kemeny says, in the cyclic process. You go back, you look at your original facts again, and you retrace your hypothesis, and you decide that it has weaknesses, and you reconstruct the model, and you look at its behavior. And you do this until you feel the hypothesis has enough, you have enough confidence in it to be useful and workable, which is very different from saying you have proved anything, because there are no proofs of any law that purports to represent the real world. There's no proof of Einstein's law of relativity. There is no proof of Ohm's law in electricity. There is only the observation that they work usefully in certain ranges, and I think that is very much what we see in system dynamics models.
I also think that you could draw a little bit of the wrong inference from the Kemeny description about the time scale with which one of these cycles happens. And I honestly think if you think about building a system dynamics model, you might go through 20 cycles of induction and deduction in an hour. Because you come up with some theory and you say, okay, I think that there's a rate formulation out of a stock looks like this. And then immediately, without saying to yourself, okay, now I'm shifting to deductive mode, you run a little test. Is this formulation robust, for example? And then you run a little test and say, well, no, if this flow happens to do this, the stock can go negative. And that violates every piece of information I know about the real world. So then you return to the induction to try and dream up a better rate formulation. I mean, I think that description sort of has this hypothetical physicist where he sits in his office for 6 months and dreams up a theory and then goes to the particle accelerator and tests it for 6 months. But in system dynamics, that cycle happens very rapidly. And I think it's almost implicit in the way things happen. I mean, if you look at dimensional analysis, having units that balance, and extreme conditions tests, I mean, those are the kinds of the art that goes with modeling. And I think good modelers do it so much a part and parcel of what they do, they hardly realize that they're shifting between those two modes of activity.
But how long that takes depends very much on the complexity of the model and the range of real-life problems you're trying to work with within that model. So yes, in some cases, a day goes through several cycles, and I would suggest that in other models, there may be weeks.
The intention of building a model is usually talking to practitioners or people that are experts in their fields and doing all that. But even that relies on the assumption that they know what's going on, such that we can come up with a theory. And many times, just to elicit the information is not easy, such that you got it.
Well, think about eliciting information. So you've said that very often people in the real world don't know what's going on. But I would suggest that a system dynamics modeler does not take at face value what is said. A lot of what you're told in fragments may be internally contradictory, may be contrary to the basic physics of the situation. And you must make choices between these different versions. And my experience has been that when you first ask a simple question, first of all, you're apt to get answers to something quite different. And as you penetrate to find the question, you will get different answers from different people. But then as you begin to make it explicit, as you begin to distill it into something that you feel is an explicit, operable model, it's been my experience that those people converge, that they rapidly come together and understand that their differences were not fundamental. They will converge on an agreement that what has come out, in fact, covers their knowledge of the real world. And I would say that to a considerable extent, what comes out does, in fact, represent the world that you're working with.
To follow on to something that Nelson was saying, one of the things that Kemeny also talks about very clearly is that the model is used for deduction. And I've always found modeling and the knowledge I've gained from modeling to be very helpful for induction. So when you see a cyclic behavior, hopefully I don't look for the same causes of cycles exactly in terms of the constructs as in another situation, but I know I need 2 stocks at least in a balancing feedback loop. And that begins to guide where I look. And so the modeling rules, Nelson mentioned the unit check and things like that, make sure unit consistency, but there are a lot of the modeling rules that I think not only are helpful deductively, but helpful inductively in coming up with our theories and realizing what sorts of structures need to be added to potentially explain the behavior we see.
A number of years ago, there was a master's thesis done here by a man named Richard Foster that I think illustrates a number of things we're dealing with this morning. He was a student in electrical engineering, and his master's thesis was on how the body uses insulin and glucose in various aspects of diabetes. That might not seem like electrical engineering, but a significant fraction of electrical engineering students go into medicine. And he did this thesis under the guidance of one of our professors of biology. But his work was really with the Joslin Clinic in Boston, where research and treatments for biology are carried on. He'd had a background in system dynamics, and he knew the kinds of things you would look for, the sorts of things you would want for a model. And as he began this, he came to me one day and he said, you know, there is nothing I want to know in the medical literature. An interesting statement, but when you pause and think about it, it's right. The medical literature discusses what happens when you try different treatments. It discusses what happens to people. It's talking about the dynamic end results, and it's not, in general, talking about the bits and pieces and their internal interactions and the levels and rates that go on in the body. On the other hand, when he went to talk to the doctors at the Joslin Clinic, everything he wanted to know was either in their heads or in their notebooks. What he wanted to know was information about all of the different reactions at different parts in the body. And you can't really write a journal article about such a fragment of information. It's, the reason it's not in the literature is that you can't really make a story out of these fragments one at a time. But taking these fragments and putting them together, he could get a model that, after some iterations, began to look very much like people under various aspects of diabetes and glucose and insulin. Now you come to the deduction phase, in which Kemeny says now you have deductions and you compare them with real life. And many times I've found, and I have observed, as in this case, that the deductions from a model give you a surprising result or an unexpected result. Now the question is this a defect in the model, or is it telling you something about real life? In his case, under some circumstance, the details I don't remember, he tried his computer simulation patient under some kind of insulin glucose set of actions, and got a result that was not in the medical literature. Now this is where the medical literature can apply, that if you have done something of this sort, what happened to the patient? He couldn't find any record that this had ever happened in real life, so the question is there perhaps something about the model that is unrealistic? He took it back to the doctors, as I recall it, showed them what was happening, and they said, well, you know, we had a patient like that once, but we always thought it was a mistake in the measurements. You have now essentially identified a syndrome, a medical syndrome, that had gone unrecognized as being meaningful until you come up with a simulation model that shows, in fact, how it could occur. Now, at this point, you have one more step in believing that you have a useful model. It's begun to tell you things about real life that nobody before realized, but as soon as you identify the particular behavior, people say, oh yes, I've seen that, I can give you some examples. And so this process of going around and around, and each time coming to a deeper understanding of the diversity of the system and the different kinds of behavior it can manifest, and then see if those differences exist in real life, is a part of the building of confidence. We don't say validation because validation implies a perfect concept of validity. We're only saying a degree of confidence. But as you move back and forth from real life structures to hypotheses to deduced behavior and compare that behavior with real life, you have a step-by-step improvement in your sense of confidence. And then how far you go is entirely an economic matter. You don't go very far before you have more confidence than you have in the mental models of the people that must make decisions. They're going to do something today. They're going to use their mental models, or they will use a more formal model. And so you move into the territory of relative confidence of models, not perfect validation, but relative confidence. And you build that sense of confidence step by step.
But then the big question comes is, what is the role of system dynamics in academia? Or maybe the way to flip that question a little bit is, what do academics have to contribute to system dynamics? And that's a much tougher issue, because I think, you know, knowing a little bit about your research, Scott, your career is not, you know, you're not going to publish a lot of papers by saying, yeah, I went and talked to this manager and he changed what he did, and boy, it sure looks like things are a lot better. Because for better or for worse, an academic typically looks at a result and says, it's a special case, you know, you haven't proven anything. There's no rigor there. But that puts you in a very tough spot, because there's a combination of the system dynamics method, which has much more of this problem focus, and academia, which typically evaluates things on a very different set of criteria. I mean, it's something that I certainly face. But I think it's a tough problem for both ways, which is how does system analysis flourish in an academic setting, but also what does academia have to contribute to an applied field like system dynamics?
Well, it seems to me that academia might face the philosophy of these issues we're talking about and discuss and write up papers on the nature of the process, how it is carried forward. Take this question that I just asked. Can you in fact have experiments? I would suggest that in the majority of cases, you already have experiments. They have been run. If you think of a particular model as, especially as you follow the theory, the concept of generic models, of transferable models, then you should be in a position of saying, here is a model of a particular, very interesting process, and it behaves in different ways when I apply different policies. Now let's go out and find in the real world where they have in fact used these different policies and see if they got the different behaviors. And so you have, I think, a very rich real-world set of experiments that people on the whole aren't adequately recognizing. There's sort of a dismissal of experiments saying you can't run them in real life, and I would say they have been run in most situations.
But there's also, this reminds me of a very interesting conversation I had with some executives that I was working with once, and I asked them, in the context of a slightly different conversation, how often do you run experiments in your organization? And they said, all the time. And I said, well, give me an example, and they ran through 5 or 6 different things. But in each case, what they called an experiment was basically their decision to do something different. I said, well, did you try it in one area and not do it in a second area so that you could compare the two? Oh, no. Once we decide to do something, we're going to do that here in this organization. So the whole notion of experimentation is a little, I think, confusing to people. It's not always just doing something different, but having 2 different treatments you might be able to compare to each other. But it puts you in a tough spot, because if by some stroke of luck the insights from that model were to lead to policy changes that would cause that reference mode no longer to happen, you would always be a victim to the criticism, well, how can you say your model had any influence? This might have just happened anyway. And I think that problem is not resolvable. But until people just need to accept this focus on system improvement, and that the ultimate measure of the study is, did things get better? And if things got better, you will always, I think in most cases, be subject to the criticism that maybe they would have just gotten better anyway. And I don't think there's really much you can do about that.
Well, that's true at every system, and I've seen it at work in corporations where you develop a model, you suggest there's a better policy, you get it followed, things evolve better as you expected, and 16 people will come up and say, it wasn't because of the model, it's what I was doing over here independent of it. And so you don't build a proof, and you only build confidence out of people's observation that confidence is justified, or out of a multiplicity of such situations where the system dynamics modeling was the only common thread among a lot of them. But we have to bear in mind that there is no possibility in real life of a proof of a theory that represents the real world. All of these discussions of proving models are only within the context of a certain set of assumptions and a certain set of data which themselves may not be representative of the real world. And so we have a considerable difference of viewpoint, I think, in the world of modeling, the world of social science, as to what validity means and the possibility of there being validity. I think we generally speak of the degree of confidence in the same sense that one would talk about confidence in the models of the physical sciences and engineering.
What about the issue of parsimony and simplicity of our models versus others? One of the things Kemeny mentioned was the idea of the simplest model, given that it explains the behavior equally well, is to be preferred.
I'll just add a little to the question too, because I think that the paradox is if the model is so simple and so clear that one has so succinctly and parsimoniously described the problem, the answers become immediately apparent, and the typical reaction is, why does one need system dynamics? What's new and different here? It was all obvious from the get-go, and the insight that is generated by just simplifying the problem is often waved over. So on the one hand, if it's too big and complex, people want to dismiss it because it's a black box. And on the other hand, if it's too simple and lucid, it was always obvious. So I think it's a great question.
But I think it's a practical matter. My experience is that, at least in academia, people can handle about one more assumption that exists in the literature. And there is that very narrow band between obvious and too complicated. And it's very unfortunate, I think, because it really restricts the types of things that people that are in academia can work on, at least if they want to publish in the top journals. And it unfairly limits the scope of the types of problems that you might want to tackle. But I do have one other comment to go back to what you said, Scott. I think one problem with the fact that the field has this kind of rapid oscillation between induction and deduction. I mean, you're constantly building theory and testing it, right? Anytime you run an extreme conditions test or say, can the stock go negative? Well, you're testing your theory that's embodied in that rate equation. But the field has evolved, so that's so much a part and parcel of what you do. It never really occurs to you to write that down in your article as part of your testing methodology. Mm-hmm. We don't have that sort of somewhat artificial distinction between you sit in your office and you deduce your theories, and then you go down in the basement and get some data off the computer tapes and test it. Because system dynamics has another unique feature: a much wider set of things is considered to be useful data. So as a consequence, I think when people go to write their papers for an academic audience, they grossly sell themselves short in terms of the volume, quantity, and types of information that have been used to specify that model. Because a dimensional analysis in extreme conditions, you're sort of taught in system dynamics, that's nothing special. You better have passed those tests before you even bother to show your model to someone else. But the fact is, in most modeling methodologies don't even pass those limited sets of tests. So I think there's a way to communicate to your audience, which I'm still certainly struggling to find, I think other people are working on, to get across this idea that you've done much more in restricting your model than I think someone might appreciate if they've been educated in other methodologies.
It's interesting because you're talking about speaking to an academic audience, and I think that a lot of the same process points apply to speaking to other audiences as well. So practitioners or people in industry and in companies, I have a sense that one of the things that feels so overwhelming about a large model is that it's presented all at once, and the steps of validation and even just gaining comfort with all the different components of the model and the intrinsic behavior patterns that they have doesn't happen. And instead, they're faced with a much larger model than human minds are capable of understanding, and hence we have to use computers to deduce. But then it makes it very difficult for people to be comfortable with the outputs of those models.